All right, so minimum movement threshold, how does it work and what does it do and how do you configure it? So first thing that we need to do is figure out how it works. So let's just draw a section of your screen, and I'll draw it as a 16 pixel grid. Now let's say you're aiming at somebody in, say, Counter-Strike, and this is their head occupying 1 pixel. I know it's very contrived, and this would almost never happen, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, that their head was occupying a single pixel, and your cursor, or your crosshair, was, say, trying to aim for that pixel. But if you were holding the controller and using the gyro, or moving your thumb across the trackpad and trying to line up a headshot with it, you'll find that your body is actually making a lot of movements that aren't very conducive to fine aiming. Humans are, they move around quite a bit, even when they're just trying to stand as still as possible. Your thumb moves quite a bit, your hands move quite a bit, so the gyro and the trackpad can become unreliable. So what minimum movement threshold does is it tries to find a way to mitigate this. So how does the cursor or the crosshair behave without minimum movement threshold? Well, you might be trying to line up this headshot, but your crosshair might end up over there, it might end up over here, it might end up over here, or right there. It might be buzzing around this pixel, around the enemy's head, but it might not actually end up there, right? So what minimum movement threshold does is it changes the amount of physical distance you need to traverse each pixel, pixel by pixel. So like, if you have a series of pixels here, let's say 8 pixels, and then you have a range of movement, and that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 millimeters. So let's just say it's a 1-to-1 ratio between pixels and millimeters, just for the sake of argument. What minimum movement threshold will do is it will actually chop down pixel by pixel how much distance across the screen you're going to be moving relative to your physical movement. So if you don't want to traverse all these pixels and have the crosshair buzzing around, the higher you set your minimum movement threshold, the more of these pixels the software is going to cut off, to where if you want to get to this pixel all the way at the end, you'll have to move the full distance, and you won't be traversing any of the pixels that occupied this space. You'll snap straight there once you reach this movement threshold. So this would be 8 millimeters to move to that 1 pixel. Not 8 millimeters to move 1 pixel, it would be 8 millimeters to move to that pixel. So you'd still be moving 8 pixels, but all of this space won't be actually traversed on the screen, if that makes sense. So that's, I explained it before in a previous video, and maybe I'm still having a little bit of difficulty explaining this accurately, but I hope this helped as a little bit of a preface to how I'm going to tell you to configure it. So to illustrate minimum movement threshold, I will probably want to use the gyro, since the accelerometer is a lot more sensitive than the surface of the trackpad. So normally, when you're configuring a setting from the default position, you're going to want to adjust it maybe in either direction until you get something that maybe is kind of comfortable or it works well enough. But in order to really understand what this setting is doing, I'm just going to ask you to max it out. Just set it balls to the wall and go back into the game, and you'll be able to feel exactly what this setting is doing. See, I'm moving the controller up and down, and you can see that there is a lot of movement, a lot of choppy movement for that crosshair. It's jumping maybe 5-6 pixels at a time based on my movement. See, like I said before, it's not you're putting in a certain amount of movement to move 1 pixel, you're putting in a certain amount of movement to get to the pixel that you would have gone to had you traversed that space with a 1-to-1 ratio between movement and pixels on the screen. So instead of requiring more movement to move 1 pixel, you're requiring the same amount of movement to travel the same amount of pixels. However, all of the pixels before you get there are cut off. And that's demonstrated on the screen. You know, it's the crosshair is moving like 4 or 5 pixels at a time. So to configure it to a point that it's comfortable, I would suggest setting it high like this and then moving it down. Very rarely you'll ever need to go more than like halfway. Let's set it down to halfway and then look at it. You know, you can still see it's pretty choppy, but it's a lot smoother. I've set it down about halfway. Now I'm moving about 3 pixels at a time, and I can feel that it's representing a lot more of my movement than it was before on the screen. But it's still moving about 3 pixels at a time. So we can go back and adjust it again. Maybe we'll bring it down to about 1/4 and see what that does. Now that's a lot smoother. You can actually see, moving my controller up and down, that this is a lot smoother. And then if you set it completely off, well, then you'll get all of that buzzing, where the cursor is kind of buzzing around because your hands are naturally moving, you know, a minimum amount at all times. So you'll get that kind of almost like cursor crosshair drift where it'll be buzzing around. And that's the kind of stuff that the minimum movement threshold was designed to mitigate. Usually around here is generally where games will be good, but I have games on my list that in order to get a favorable result, I had to set it to about 1/4. And there are some games where to get a favorable result, I only had to set it, you know, 1 notch. But for a game like this, I guess this would be pretty reasonable, maybe even a little higher. Yeah, I think that's probably about all I can say on the matter. It's really hard to describe what it does, and I hope I did an adequate job of describing what it does.